Welcome to the Unzip Mind podcast. My name is Nick Smith. I'm here with Greg Minikis, Dylan Jessen, and Carly Samick.
Hi, thanks for having me, guys.
Thanks for coming on and sitting down with us. Today we have Carly coming on because we're going to dive deep into, start to dive deep into the very large world of obsessive compulsive disorders.
Mm-hmm. We're definitely going to dive, but considering how big of a topic this is, OCD, anxiety, we will be diving to some level below the surface. But yeah, there's probably a lot more depth that we can get into.
Yeah, it's going to be one we reconnect with. Carly, can you introduce yourself to our listeners? What brings you on? What do you specialize in? What's your background?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm a clinical therapist, and I specialize in the treatment of OCD and anxiety disorders. Like you guys said, it's a big umbrella. I'm happy to break into kind of more specifics of that umbrella. But I've been a therapist for over a decade. I've spanned between areas of like inpatient psychiatric care to intensive outpatient, some non-for-profit work, juvenile detention work. But I kind of found myself centered in the anxiety OCD world as my career grew and developed, and I kind of found my own voice as a clinician. I really found myself endeared to the OCD population. It's a really misunderstood diagnosis and disorder. It's ridiculously common, which is, so unfortunate that it is so misunderstood. And then there's also like very effective treatment, which is not always the case. Not always do we have treatment in the therapy world that is like so effective and is quite accessible if you find the right people doing it. So that's kind of what brought me into that world.
Yeah, we do see sort of the range of, in our work at the hospital, we see a range of patients who have disorders that are treatable to patients who have disorders that don't seem to be treatable at all. Mm-hmm. Like we get people who have, depression, anxiety, cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be pretty effective for treating those in some cases. Psychosis can be treated by, some combination of medication and therapy, but then we see like treatment-resistant psychosis, people who have had these voices, had these delusions for years, and it seems like no amount of medication helps. People with personality disorders, it seems very difficult to treat. So I don't know. I know very little about OCD, so it's heartening for me to hear that it's treatable, and I'm excited to get into the sort of dynamics of the disorder and what the treatments are.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you just start and just kind of define OCD for us? Kind of like how it dips into that disorder aspect of compulsions.
Absolutely. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, and via the DSM diagnosis, which is, my handbook. So every doctor has their diagnosis handbook. Therapists have their own. It's referred to as the DSM. The diagnosis presents with obsessions. So these are frequent obsessive thoughts, ruminations, which basically I think of it as like chewing on the same thought over and over, that are typically very much related to a patterned theme. There's some really, really common themes, so much that we actually refer to them as subtypes. So a person has to present with obsessions, but they also have to present with compulsions. So compulsions are defined as either a mental or physical behavior. More people are aware of the physical because they think of like sitcoms and movies of people things orderly, but the majority of people actually are affected by mental compulsions, and it can be terrorizing for them because these are behaviors. A compulsion by definition is something that a person feels urged to do over and over again. It's not inherently they want to be doing either. So they don't always want to be thinking over and over about this thing. It's almost like their mind becomes an echo chamber that's sort of bullying them. So those are the two kind of primary, but then alongside of that, this is something that is affecting a person's day for at least an hour. More than not, the individuals I work with are affected upwards of their entire day. Their entire day is affected and ruled by what OCD says to do. And then also it's not caused by an onset of like medical change or injuries. Those are kind of the primary criteria that I'm looking for. As a whole, it's part of the compulsive disorder family. So other compulsive disorders are like phobias are often put under that. Those are obsessive type, hoarding, trichotillomania, which refers to the hair pulling, or exorcism, which is skin picking. So those are all under the compulsive umbrella, all of which I treat. And then anxiety disorders that are similar, kind of in the same vein that I treat: social anxiety, panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, health anxiety. They kind of sit in a similar family group in terms of how I treat them.
Yeah, I can see that.
That was one of Thank you for that. That was like one of the best ways I've heard it broken down.
Yeah, super concise.
Super like just and you said something too that I actually wanted to touch on. If you don't mind like backing up just a little bit, it's when you were saying that what people see depicted in sitcoms and movies, that behavioral side of things. How do you think like in that context, like with media and cinema, what are your thoughts on how OCD is depicted? And like, do you think that media has been doing OCD justice, or do you think it's kind of glorifying what OCD is?
I will do my best to be concise because I could probably grandstand this one for a minute.
Please grandstand. I would love to hear it.
Get on that soapbox. Yeah. You stand on it and you just say your piece.
Own it.
I don't think they've done a great job at it at all. So 1 in 40 people, the World Health Organization has identified that at least 1 in 40 people suffer of OCD. And the numbers can be even more drastic in the pediatric or the child population. We aren't able to gain numbers on them as clearly as we can adults because kids often don't know what's happening to them. So it's not uncommon that I have an adult person who comes to me because their OCD is so pronounced at that point, and after some education, they're like, this has been around since I was 6 years old. I've been dealing with this forever. So people, and most people are walking around not knowing that's exactly what it is. They've been told they have depression or they have anxiety, yet any of the typical treatments that work for generalized anxiety or depression do not work for them. And there's some really clear treatment differences between how you would go after more generalized anxiety, depression versus OCD. And then the last bit that's, I think, really mind-blowing too, is that most people, you probably know someone who has OCD that may not even recognize that they have it. So this is all to say that I don't think the media does a really great job of demonstrating, because if it did, then more people would be aware of what OCD actually looks like. They would maybe be able to seek out help more frequently. I think as is true with a lot of things, so this is not OCD specific, the media and movies kind of take one little stereotype and then just like grow it because it can be funny or it can be silly or it grabs attention. But the problem is that, again, this is a disorder that is top 10 in the World Health Organization's most common disorders, but also the disorder that causes the most distress in a person's life and depression in a person's life. I don't think they do a wonderfully great job. People are usually like pretty surprised to hear me break down OCD the way I did for you guys. And many people are like, whoa, I either know someone who can relate to this or they feel like they can relate to it.
100%. Yeah. That's like, and that's right away, like with the way you broke it down and how you talked about it, that's exactly how I felt. And like I myself definitely, it's not diagnosed by a doctor. I easily could go do it, but I 100% have OCD. And the reason I was asking that too is because like I feel like in media what you get is kind of a very generic, like the you need to hit the door handle 3 times before I leave the door, click it, and it's usually depicted as like the nerdy, very uptight, clean cut person who looks like they have their life together, but then there's this disorder behind the kind of the curtains thing, or they're the murderer and they're the ones who keep everything clean. Yeah. And like they are like top notch, best killer ever. And you're like, that's the depiction. And then that translates into just sort of like common usage of just like, oh, I'm so OCD. I have heard that. You probably are sick of that to like even much more so than I am. But I hear that anyone who is talking about that they're clean, fastidious, that they're orderly, that automatically translates into OCD. Yeah. And I have been guilty of that in the past, but more recently, since working in mental health, working with some patients who have OCD, I am starting to hate that. And well, hate is a strong word. I try not to be hateful, but I do find it very insensitive to say, you keep your apartment clean and your drinking glass and your napkin is always in the same place. Therefore, you are so OCD. I do find that very insensitive because it like you're not suffering to nearly the same extent as someone who, as you said, it's like disruptive and distressing in their lives for like at least 1 hour per day. And you're saying for a lot of patients, it's the entire day.
Absolutely. And I will say, like, I probably I have far less empathy for the media because I'm like, y'all have lots of money. Get a researcher, go get a therapist on your team, ask if this is the case. But then for someone who doesn't know any better, I mean, they don't know any better. So, it's it's I've seen like the acronym used, like obsessive Christmas disorder. Like we've seen it used in a zillion different ways that are just like couldn't be more. It couldn't be more of a tangent from what OCD actually is. That being said, you try to use that as an opportunity to have a conversation with someone. So despite like my zone, I mean, I'm still educating family members of mine, friends of mine, because it is, again, it's really not well understood. It's not well something so common,
and it's not a person's fault that they haven't had the same kind of education about it that you have, or like they don't work in mental health like we do.
And that's like that's the beautiful thing of the position where like yourself, Carly, that you're in. And I love that you said you use it as a moment of education instead of being like exasperated or be like, golly gee. Because like that's where I find essentially what we're doing, right? And like why we do what we're doing in this podcast is like you don't know what you don't know. And especially with media now, I think it's a double-edged sword, right? I love that in media things are becoming more normalized, like ADHD, anxiety, OCD. It's becoming more normalized to talk about, but because it's coming out, everybody's like, "Oh, I got that." It's kind of like the WebMD thing, right? We have intimate knowledge of what's going on behind the scenes, and we have the experience, and so we have the privilege and the honor to educate and to able to help others understand, like, yeah, you might have tendencies to do certain things. That doesn't make you OCD. That doesn't give you OCD, right? Like you just like to keep your stuff in order. That's good, right? Like you have some sort of discipline. Good on you.
Some people may be a little more fastidious about it than others, maybe a little on the compulsive side, but like I personally, I am pretty orderly. I could be cleaner, but I am quite orderly. Like I keep, like the examples that I use weren't arbitrary. Like I keep my sort of napkin and my drinking glass in like pretty much the same place at my sort of place at my table in my apartment at all times. It's not something that I spend a lot of time on. I definitely don't spend nearly an hour on this kind of arrangement. So I have some compulsions, I think, but it's not, I don't think it's diagnosable as a disorder, as a compulsive disorder. So I agree. I do want to have compassion for people who don't have the same kind of education or haven't been exposed to the same opportunities. But I would also encourage people in general, this is, I'll just briefly step on a soapbox, to not just kind of throw out diagnoses in sort of a casual way. Like the two that I hear the most commonly are OCD and PTSD. Like, oh yeah, I went to that metal show and it was really loud, and now I have PTSD from it. Or like, I have PTSD from that metal show because it was loud and there was a guy in corpse paint or something. Or like, oh yeah, I keep my apartment clean. I'm so OCD. Like, yeah, I encourage people to try to educate themselves and try to acknowledge the amount of distress that these disorders cause people, and not just sort of like self-ID as OCD or PTSD, just sort of like frivolously, I guess. But yeah, all right, soapbox done. Stepping off it.
Appreciated that though. I mean, applaud to that one too, because I couldn't.
Yeah, and part of it just comes from my own annoyance at myself for having thrown those terms out frivolously in describing myself. So I'm trying to just maybe self-flagellate a little bit.
Well, can I? Is there space for two?
No, there can only be one.
Shit. All right. Well, I'm gonna grab my own, and I'm gonna stand next to you.
Yeah, take it.
Well, no, it's just like, here's the thing, and it's not, I guess it's not really soapbox, but where I'm coming from with the education part and things is that I feel that where we are right now, and I know we're stepping a little away from OCD right now, but hear me out. I feel that we are in a place where people need to feel that they belong to something and that they need to identify with something. And labels are how we identify with things. So like, that's a group of people. So if I say, oh, I have OCD or I'm OCD, like now I can identify with others who have OCD and now I'm part of something. You know what I mean? So like, I just feel like, we got to be okay with just being who we are, and we can identify as I'm me.
Yeah, I'm a little compulsive. Yeah. I'm a little fastidious.
Yeah. You know what I mean?
I think it's cool to be able to have language like that for yourself too. And to your point, it's how cool would it be if I say this all the time, what would life be like? What would the world be like if rather than the first thing we learn in school is ABCs, 1, 2, 3s, instead we learn about how our brain works, how our body works, are. Like if we had language, there are so many people that come to session with me who don't have language to describe what they're feeling or even like what their thoughts are doing or what their behaviors are doing. They kind of feel like I'm just walking around hoping for the best. And it's this crazy empowering moment when they can go, yeah, that's a compulsion or that's a ritual. And to your guys' points, everybody has the ability to ruminate. So like one of my go-tos if I'm really stressed out is to ruminate. I get stuck in my head and I chew on the same thought over and over. Criteria for OCD because they don't hit all of those criterion marks. But that's the other thing that I think is really interesting and people kind of miss about mental health is that the word disorder is meant to describe that this thing is actually detrimental to a person, and a person can. So I have a lot of people I work with who, technically speaking, probably don't meet criteria anymore for OCD because they're in recovery, their treatment worked. But that doesn't mean that any person can't have rituals or a compulsion that they do here and there because the brain likes it. There's a really strong reason compulsions are interesting to humans in general. The brain really, really likes it because there's so much ease and sort of a soothing that comes from it. But to you guys' point, to have that language to be able to say, I'm a little compulsive here and there. That would be the interchange of, I'm so OCD for, I'm just a little compulsive. If we all had that language from the jump, hold it.
Yo, yeah. I'm just gonna snap on that. Damn.
Knowing that language,
it gives thanks, you Carly.
Like once you have that language, now I have insight into my own experience. I have insight into my own feelings, and I'm just gonna briefly step back on the soapbox. I'm also not sort of like appropriating this label that indicates huge distress that I don't have because I don't suffer from my compulsions and my ruminations for an hour a day, let alone the whole day. So it's definitely good to have the insight, and to ideally we can educate ourselves about what these disorders actually are and what they aren't.
Well, you guys are doing that too, by the way. This podcast is doing that. So you guys are on your way to making it a possibility for everyone, which I'm grateful for, deeply grateful.
I feel like you're doing it more,
Carly,
and we're just receiving.
Thank you for that supportive statement. Damn, that was a little cut fill right there.
So let's.
I have a question for you though. I do, and going because we've been kind of dancing around this little subject here, and it's something that I'm wondering. What are I'm just gonna just ask you. What are some of the barriers that you see? Or that you encounter with your client base, or that you're aware of within this population?
For sure. I'd say that one of the biggest barriers is that it is so misunderstood. So and this is by therapists too. I should say it's not just misunderstood by individuals who are living with it, but unfortunately it's really common that therapists, myself, there was a point in which I was not as fully educated and fully aware of what OCD really entailed. Because when you go to school to become a therapist, depending on what kind of program you go to, I went to a clinical program that focused on therapy, it focused on group counseling, it focused on abnormal psych, but you get a real generalized, it's sort of similar to a doctor, you get a very generalized education, and then you have to go into the field and choose to specialize. The difference between, let's say, like a medical person and someone like myself is therapists don't inherently have to choose to specialize. They can be a generalized or a generalist, we'll call it. So you kind of have a good understanding of what the DSM says. So for instance, I worked in inpatient psychiatric care. So I was seeing the gamut, both as I worked on the unit, and then I did the group direction. And then I transitioned into a therapist role after grad school. So I was seeing the gamut of mental health. I saw a lot of individuals with OCD, but I didn't understand the disorder. So I think that in itself, like the mental health community actually has to have a better understanding of it. And to do so, individuals like myself. So I just did a training recently with a group of therapists that are a little south of me who wanted to learn more about avoidance behaviors and how that relates to potentially obsessive compulsive thinking. Providers need to go out of their way to educate themselves. More so, they need to know their own scope of practice. So for instance, if someone comes to me and says, I really need treatment for relationship counseling, I'm not a relationship therapist. I've never counseled anyone through a relationship. I would not be the right fit for them. So that's outside of my scope. I need to know how to direct that person. So I actually think a huge barrier is within the mental health community itself. Therapists really need to hold themselves accountable. If you've not put in the hours and you've not done the certifications and the specialization, you can't really say that you specialize in that thing. You need to seek out the people who do to gain some counsel as to, can you be the best fit for this person and what their needs are? Second to that, I mean, this is not going to be surprising to you guys in the least, but mental health is just really, really hard to access still. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do right now in my own private practice is to create really, really accessible programming. So if an individual can't afford to do therapy, they don't have the time, whatever it may be, they can maybe buy this like very cheap, very effective programming to at least educate themselves. But access is still a really, really big problem.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's an important point. Maybe the biggest barrier would be that sort of financial barrier or the cultural barrier of like stigma about mental health. So people aren't willing to seek treatment. I mean, you know, working in inpatient, we see that a lot of people who don't have the money for healthcare, they are not coming in for any kind of mental health treatment until they have reached a crisis point, until they've gotten to the point where they have attempted suicide or they're having a major psychotic break or something like that. So yeah, that probably is the biggest barrier, right? Like the financial barrier and just the fact that like it's not as accepted in the culture. Well, there are many cultures and subcultures where seeking healthcare is frowned upon, especially mental health care.
Well, I imagine too with compulsive disorders, there's a lot of shame too because you're so self-aware in a lot of aspects of what's going on, but you can't control it.
Right.
So you couldn't be more right. That would be, I would say, if I were going to speak more specifically to OCD, I got kind of, again, in the more generalized, but to OCD, so we think of clean, we think of cleanliness, we think of just right, perfectionism type themes. But honestly, one of the most common themes is what we call taboo subtypes. So this is harm OCD, this is different sexually intrusive thoughts, gender, sexuality. I mean, anything that is considered a taboo subject, OCD can launch onto. OCD tends to go after the things, or the theme to which OCD tends to go after is often related to what a person values. It's why it's so grabbing for them. So if they care about being a really good person, it's really terrorizing when your mind keeps asking you, what if you're going to hurt someone you love? Or speaking of culture and like a home or a household where certain orientations were not as accepted, what if I'm gay? What if I'm transgender? You know, that can come up, and they want to be a good person. They want to be able to make sure that they are caring and loving of all people despite their orientations. And their brains are saying, what if all day long, making them doubt themselves.
That is really interesting, really powerful.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
I've not thought about it in that context. And like now, so in a I guess a shortened version, right? Like of a summarized version. What you're saying is that OCD in its part of its disorder and how it's part of its cynicism, if you will, is that it attaches to our insecurities or our what we hope that isn't real, is that's what it's latching onto, is that insecurity part of us that we're like hoping isn't. And that whereas a more neuro-normalized individual would be able to be like, yeah, that's just not me. I don't need to worry about that. I know that that's not where I want to go, where someone who is neurodivergent and is dealing and battling with OCD, it latches onto that insecurity and is like, yeah, but what if you're going to hurt yourself? Like you really want to, right? And I think putting it in that context just brings it more toward normalizing, where it's like everyone could potentially, if you choose to ruminate and then you go down this path, you can start building these neural pathways to a compulsion.
Yeah.
And that's the form. I'm thank you for bringing up more of that. I kind of put it as like a darker side, but I get how that would be, I guess, more insensitive, stigmatizing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah,
but like I like the idea of like they're taboo subjects.
Yeah, because those, I would say, Carly, in our world, and as you know, like you were telling us, where your background comes from, working in inpatient as well. In our world, we tend to see that side of OCD. We see the individuals who have compulsive sexual tendencies, where they will come up and talk to us and be like, "I'm having these dark thoughts right now." Yep. And I cannot help it. And we're like, okay, let's talk about it. Let's journal it. Let's get it out. Because I feel that, and you know, please give us your opinion on this. I feel that when you give it a voice, when you are putting it out there and you're not holding on to it, you release its power.
Hugely so. And one of the other pieces of this disorder that is a little complicated, but also makes so much sense once you better understand it, is just because a person is having thoughts doesn't mean that they actually have any intention or any plan. So, for instance, like harm OCD, these are individuals who go out of their way to hide from anything or get away from anything that could be harmful. So, I have individuals that I work with who haven't touched a knife, like a butter knife, in years. I have that I work with whom absolutely adore their friends and family, but because of their OCD and the OCD focusing on what if you are a bad person or what if you've done this wrong thing, they haven't spoken to them in over a year. So another major facet of the actual disorder itself is that the thoughts are like bullies, but the action couldn't contradict the thoughts more. So the thought of what if I hurt this person? An individual with OCD is going to get as far away from that person as absolutely possible. So this is makes their world this big. I mean, that's why most people end up coming into therapy, is because OCD webs out and it touches everything and it gets stickier and stickier. We often describe like thoughts as sticky when we're describing OCD thoughts. And to your point earlier, so talking about those thoughts and taking them outside of a person, externalizing them, is a huge part of seeing the process over the content. So a big piece of what I do with individuals is help them to see their thought process versus the specific little details that are terrorizing them. Again, OCD after their vulnerabilities and their values, it's one and the same.
It's just so interesting. I keep relating it mentally in my mind to like psychosis and like command hallucinations, command auditory hallucinations, where they're, it's these voices and these identities that are telling you these horrible things or telling you to do these horrible things. But then, relating it to it's like your thoughts. It's your thoughts. So it knows you better than anyone. It's just, it's super interesting.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of individuals who come in initially thinking that they have maybe an auditory hallucination because it's so loud, but they recognize the voice, which is even more terrifying for them. And they don't agree. All these thoughts ego dystonic, meaning they're different from their ego. So they're having these thoughts, they're loud, they feel so important and so real. These compulsions feel so important and real. And often the compulsions have nothing to do with the thought. So for instance, I'll have someone with harm OCD that does like a 20-minute long bedtime ritual because it's the only way they'll feel secure in knowing they won't get up out of bed and harm their loved one. So the compulsion look drastically different than the thoughts, but they recognize that these thoughts, they don't like them, they don't agree with them, and that's one of the other terrifying pieces of it.
So do you find yourself, because with a lot of what you've been saying, especially with OCD, right, it sounds like it is an unbearable form of dissonance. And so do you find that you within treatment, and I do want to dive into what, because you were saying that this is very treatable, and I guess like double up on this question. One, do you find that a lot of what you're doing within treatment is closing that dissonance gap? And then two, what does treatment for OCD in all aspects, like generalized OCD to more specified and more taboo style of OCDs, what does that treatment look like? And especially in the terms of the taboo treatments, because I think that's something that when I asked you earlier, like the barriers to treatment, I feel like that could easily be a barrier, is that taboo and the stigmatization of like, I have pedophilic thoughts, but like, what do I do with that? Right. And how do I talk to somebody about that? So how do you treat things like that?
Oh yeah. I definitely think that a part of my work is helping them kind of close that dissonance. That awareness that I don't like these thoughts, yet they're so loud and they happen so frequently, and I don't know what else to do but to do these compulsions. To close that gap is definitely a big piece of it. So the golden standard care for OCD is called exposure response therapy, exposure response prevention. A lot of people have also seen this in media or TV portrayed as, being forced to ride an elevator or go near a snake if they're afraid of it. And that's barely touching it. So that's the exposure part. And I always say like the exposure is like the jazz fingers. Everyone's like, ooh, what kind of exposures do you do with people? But the real magic is when you help someone do the last part. Response prevention is the equivalent to compulsion management. So I help people learn how to not do their compulsions, which is terrifying. Because again, the brain is saying, the only way you're going to gain certainty that you will be okay, or that those thoughts don't matter, or that nothing bad is going to happen, is if you do this compulsion. So there's this association that's built in the brain that I must do this compulsion. Again, it can be a 20-minute ritual that has nothing to do with the thoughts at all. Be chewing on the thoughts for a certain period of time. If they feel like that they don't do that, then the bad thing could occur. Something that I think is such a cool fact. We have stats that go back as far as the 1400s that were literature or like journaling from probably what were at that point, like, I don't know if we would call them therapists, but doctors, people who would treat people about the doubting disorder, describing people who just could not stop thinking about certain thoughts and certain worries and certain uncertainties. And what we've come to recognize is that was OCD. So it's historically known as the doubting disorder. The compulsions and what I help people to do less of by way of exposures is what keeps the doubting disorder alive. So think of the compulsions as the food for the beast. I help them starve the beast is the best way to describe it.
So that's fascinating. So in exposure and response prevention, ERP therapy, the exposure is more familiar to me because my understanding is that there's like for phobias, there's like graduated exposure therapy, so like gradual exposure therapy, where if you have arachnophobia, first you start by looking at a picture of a spider, and then you might start by having us go into a museum or not a museum, like a zoo where there's a spider in a glass tank, something like that. So that kind of graduated exposure. So that's intuitive. I'm curious about how that relates to OCD, but I'm more curious about this response prevention piece. Because for OCD, it's very mysterious to me. Let's say the example that you gave was a person has this obsession, or they have this obsession that they might harm one of their loved ones if they don't do a certain ritual before bedtime. So what is the logic that connects those two things? Because to me, that's a very mysterious connection. How does this 20-minute pre-bed ritual relate at all to your willingness to kill somebody or hurt somebody? And then how do you disrupt that logic? Like that's very mysterious. I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, great question. So there is no logic. And that's actually one of the most terrorizing pieces. Again, because the individual is so aware of the fact that these thoughts are scare them, that they don't like them. They recognize this is ridiculous. Why am I doing this 20-minute ritual? Why am I hiding from a butter knife? I couldn't even harm someone with a butter knife if I really tried to. So they're completely aware. And that's part of that dissonance of like, I don't like these thoughts and this is ridiculous, but their fear response is a big piece of why they feel like they have to do it. So what we're going to learn about OCD is that it's really, as we've sort of been describing already, kind of a neurodivergence. It's not simply an anxiety disorder. There's so much fMRI or the MRIs that take a look at your brain. The work that's being done is showing that a lot of this is happening in the frontal cortex, just like ADHD does, a lot of like autism. So what we're coming to recognize is that it's really a misprocessing. So an individual's brain with OCD is processing a thought as a threat. So what if I don't do this ritual tonight, I'll hurt my family? An individual who doesn't have OCD is going to have, those are referred to as intrusive thoughts, egodystonic thoughts. I have egodystonic intrusive thoughts all the time. We all do. They're just a part of having a brain that works. I'll have a thought like that and go, that was interesting. Didn't really like it, but it was just a thought. An individual with OCD that's active, that's in a disordered state is going to go, whoa, that feels really important because their brain has now turned on their fear response. Their amygdala has been by it. So now even completely illogical, this random association of things has occurred probably because they did that random ritual one night and it felt a little better. So the brain is saying, this is how you'll know with certainty. Because again, it's all about creating that doubt. OCD wants that doubt to breathe and breathe louder. So when we're working with an individual who is, let's say, we'll just focus on the bedtime ritual for one, it's going to be a combination of a couple things. First and foremost, it's education. Education is power in my mind on all fronts. I would say a major facet of what I do as a therapist is educate people about how their brain works, how, the purpose of what their treatment is. So they never go into any kind of work with me that they don't understand the complete function of or the purpose of. We start to understand the function. So we do a lot of like meaning making and function analysis. So this helps me better understand what their fear is associating, what they're sticky to. And then it's really creative. We create some very, very creative exposures. There's a couple of different kinds, but often for taboo subjects, we use what's called imaginal. So this is any kind of creative exposure. So one exposure idea could be, let's say this individual, their OCD is saying, what if you get out of bed and harm your loved one with a knife unless you do this ritual? I might have them draw a picture of themselves with a knife in their hand, or I've actually had them draw like a little mini knife and like stick it in their back pocket, and they have to keep that knife on them all day long. But it can be visualizing. It can be saying things out loud. So what you're doing is exposing your brain to this material enough that you do get some of that OCD response, that fear response, and you're going to want to do a compulsion. And that's when I jump in as a coach and help them to resist that compulsion. Sometimes it's as simple as just leaning. I shouldn't say simple. It's not simple at all, but straightforward as leaning into the process, letting that discomfort being there, and then letting it dissipate, because as we sit with it, the brain starts to go, nothing bad has happened. So maybe this thing doesn't actually have all that logic to begin with. And then sometimes it's bringing that compulsion to a smaller and smaller point until it's finally eliminated.
I love all of that.
There's a strong role of mindfulness there, because you were talking about sitting with the compulsion and just watching it and letting it sort of diminish on its own. So mindfulness must really factor strong. I saw a couple of your interviews. Mindfulness factors pretty strongly into your own practice, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. And I will say, I would say that mindfulness across the OCD community is a very well-regarded facet of ERP, but then I also really utilize it. This is more my personal bias. So alongside OCD care and being a therapist, I'm also a restorative yoga teacher. I focus on mindfulness type restorative poses using different sensory objects, specific styles of meditations. It's so much, I would say mindfulness and ERP are so much faceted in that sense of we can let a moment be temporary and we don't have to fix it or change it, aka compulsion. We can just ride that wave and see it to the other side.
That is, again, amazing. I love that. And it speaks very much to mindfulness and just being more aware of our body and what our minds are telling us. And I think realizing too, and this is what mindfulness at least has helped me realize personally, and I don't know with you, Greg, either, but it brings awareness that our brains can be little tricksters if we allow them to be. They are very powerful. And that's what's so interesting and tantalizing about our minds, is that we are not in full control of our minds. Our minds control what's going on with us and how we respond to this electrical stimuli that is our brain, is how we build our brain. And it's this very, I don't know, it's this interesting, unknown, known subject that is just so tantalizing. And somehow the simple, again, not simple, but simple mindfulness is a way of unlocking that brain and unlocking the pathways and the roadways our brains build. It's very interesting.
I'm glad it's becoming more mainstream. I definitely wasn't hearing about meditation or mindfulness practice in a mental health context 10 years ago when I first started to get, therapy myself, or 15 years ago now. There is, we kind of mentioned there was a vast ocean of topics that we could get into. I want to, there's so much I want to ask you about. Maybe before we close, I could ask about, but you had something?
Well, we got a little bit, we got some time, but that's where going into mindfulness too, Carly, I wanted to address that because you do a couple different things. You've talked to and alluded to that you have your private practice in upstate New York. And then also you have a social media platform, Counseling with Carly, on Instagram, I believe, and TikTok, I believe.
Yeah, TikTok's quiet, but just because I'm getting better at using both, but Instagram I'm neglecting less, let's put it that way.
I love that. But okay, so here's my question for you with that and pertaining to your mindfulness practice and everything. First of all, what's the reception that you've been receiving from offering that space, from using social media as a tool, not just as this marketing scene, but as an actual tool to reach others and to, I see it as you're educating, and two, you're creating an accessible space for others who can't necessarily come into therapy all the time, right? Because what you're doing isn't therapy, but you are educating from the reels and things that I've seen from your social media platform. So first, what's the reception that you've received from that? And then if you don't mind also do you find that your clients are also benefiting, that your clients that you're working with in your private practice as well, are they benefiting from that space that you're offering as well on social media?
Oh, yeah. I will say going into social media with me as a therapist, sort of like Carly the therapist, it was an exposure for me. It was something that felt very uncertain and something that was scary. When I went to school to become a therapist, even before that, just as I entered the field, let's say 12, 15 years ago at this point, a little bit less than that, more like 12, 10-ish years ago, you were supposed to be like a blank canvas. You really weren't supposed to be a person who had their own story or was a person who had opinions about things. That's really changed. I'm grateful for that. And for all the reasons that you mentioned, it's making therapy feel less stigmatized. So when I'm a real person, when someone can see me on my page and see me be silly or hear me talk or hear me discuss certain things, they're already getting a sense of what they might get if they work with me one-on-one. But also that therapists aren't scary. I mean, this is what I look like when I show up to session. Often it's even worse. This is my hair on top of my head. I wear overalls. Like, I'm not stuffy. I'm not showing up with like a button up with like my spectacles, although I do wear glasses a lot because I look at screens a lot.
Therapists are humans? Human beings? What? Real people? Shock. So unprofessional.
Oh, I have actually, there's one video with my sister that's great. It's what's it like to be I have a little series, what's it like to be a blank to a therapist. So I've got my husband, my sister on there. I've got a friend who I'm doing it with. And they will be happy to tell you that we're not only human, but we're really annoying.
Yeah, I'm already pretty annoying.
I love it. Oh my gosh. So last question for you. For this time, because I don't think this will be the last time we see you, Carly. But so when I was doing my little research and back stuff on you before you came on, I came across that you are hoping to do some research and finding a correlation between people's awareness and their sources and levels of hope and their ability to self-actuate. How's that going?
Oh, it's going really good. I mean, this is something that I feel like as a human, not just as a therapist, is near and dear to my heart. So, much of my research right now is anecdotal. It's me utilizing my session space to create modalities, to create specific exercises for people to try so that I feel more confident then bringing it to the bigger population. But it's been very well received both with my colleagues in the field as well as with individuals that I'm treating. And if I were to just give a brief synopsis on it, one of the things I was noticing within my counseling was I'd be working with someone and let's say they had 3 goals. They'd meet all those goals. Their OCD for all intents and purposes was recovered. So they were no longer in an activated state of mental health crisis. So you'd think that they would be feeling fabulous. And it was really common that I would notice this hesitancy or this sadness or this sort of unease when I'd ask, well, how are you doing? Or you did the thing that you said you wanted to do. We finally did it. Woohoo. It was not a woohoo moment. They were often seeming very held back. The more that I dug and understood the function of the thinking, it was a lot of a lack of hope or also a fear of hope. So the OCD or doubt itself, and I think this is actually more of a human thing. I don't think it's just an OCD thing. We hold ourselves back from being hopeful. I think people often hope with wishful thinking. So if I'm hopeful, then I'm just overly wishful. The definition of hope is a positive regard for the uncertain future. So it just means being an open-minded person to the future, which is an incredibly healthy thing to do. One thing we know for sure in terms of cognitive science is that mental flexibility, plasticity is very, very healthy. And so hope is a huge muscle for that. So I inject hope into my exposure work with individuals. So it's someone who maybe holding a butter knife was massive for them a year ago. Let's say not even a year ago, a couple of months prior to that moment, we do a hope exposure about something they want or that they want to work towards. That can be just as terrifying for them to name those things. So I'd say that's a longer synopsis of what I'm doing with hope work right now.
That is so interesting and so cool. Oh, I love it. And I look forward to keeping up on that and hearing more as you dive down that research hole.
Yeah, because hope is definitely an under-researched and I would say under-emphasized concept in I mean, my experience of psychology and in mental health. Like, it's not something that I think too much about, but it is like the driving force behind much of our healthy activity. It's like the only reason that I'm going to wake up on time and exercise and try to, you know, make plans with people and be social is because I have hope that like these things will give me joy and give me like a balanced life. You know, so that's a great area of work, really a really rich area of research. I'd love to talk more with you about.
Whenever you guys want, I could go on for days about it. I mean, you hit the nail on the head. We talk about it in religion. We talk about it in spirituality. We bring up hope a lot, but we don't really understand its function. So that's really what to do is marry sort of this more existential meaning work with cognitive science. And I think hope is a really interesting kind of in between of those spaces.
Please do it. Please do that work. Please keep doing it.
Yeah.
Not just because I told you to, but
if the Unzip Mind can help you in any way, you please let us know because we are here for that. And Carly, before we let you go, can you let our listeners know where can they find you?
Yeah. So, I mean, the easiest space to find me is Counseling with Carly on Instagram. There is a TikTok, but again, it's a little more neglected. I will have an up and running website that I'll link on my Instagram probably early this fall, where I'm hoping to offer different workshops, programming that you can buy for yourself. So it can be like a 101 on hope, or it'll be a 101 on like compulsive behaviors and how to manage them. But that would be the easiest way to find me.
All right.
Very cool.
So you heard it, people. Go over to Instagram, Counseling with Carly. And look out for that website. And again, we thank you very much. And if you guys like what you hear, if you want to support our show, please hit that like and subscribe button on any of the platforms you are listening to us right now. It really helps us out. It helps that algorithm grow. With the more support we get, the more we get to do. We love doing this. So go head on over to our Facebook page. Let us know what you like, what you don't, what you want to hear. Or if you just want to say hello. We love reaching out and connecting with everybody. So, yep.
Yeah.
Head on over to the Unzip Mind. Hit that like and subscribe button. We'll chat with you guys next Monday. Thank you.
Thank you so much,
and
Carly.
Yeah, Carly, thank you so much for your time. It was great talking with you. Meeting you.
Thank you, guys.